This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Welcome back, everyone, to what is a boiling hot Brussels today. And just to say, if you do see any of us on stage sweating profusely, it's not necessarily because of the awkward questioning, it is because the sun is incredibly hot today. So do excuse us if you do see us sweating. We do have fans here as well, yes. We have POLITICO branded hand fans. So for those of you in attendance personally, you can maybe take those home. And one day they might become collector's items. But there you go. Thank you very much for joining us here today for what I hope will be an engaging discussion on Europe's arm wrestling contest with big tech as part of this year's Competitive Europe Summit brought to you by POLITICO Live. My name is Samuel Stolten. I'm a reporter at POLITICO covering competition and tech, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel where we shall hone in on the recently adopted Digital Markets Act and how it could impact the business models of gatekeeper platforms, whether or not there could be a coming wave of litigation against the rules, and we'll also discuss the importance of regulatory dialogue in the implementation of the new prohibitions and obligations and what the future of the digital economy looks like with these landmark rules in place. For this cause, we are very pleased to be joined by a range of those working at the forefront of these issues. Here in person, we are very pleased to welcome Gerard de Graaf, Director for Digital Transformation at the European Commission's DG Connect. We also have with us Ollie Bethel, Director for Europe, Middle East, Asia Competition at Google. And we also have MEP Alexandra Geese from the Green Group. For those of you in attendance, both in person and online, we'd love to pose some of your questions to the panel this afternoon. So please log in to the Swapcard app and submit your questions there. And also don't forget to get involved with the debate on Twitter using the hashtag #PoliticoCompetition. So without further ado, this is quite a short panel. We have about 40 minutes or so. I think we're just about ready now to jump straight in to the discussion this afternoon. And perhaps, Mr. de Graaf, we could start with you first. We've had a couple of months now since the rules were adopted on the 24th of March. Obviously, they still have to be ratified by Parliament, and we are expecting them to come into force in October and the platforms to be brought into compliance sometime early 2024. What sort of work is the Commission doing in this interim period? How are you reorganizing DG Connect and DG Comp into this new DMA task force? Perhaps you could give us a bit of an insight.
Yes, I can. Good afternoon, everyone. I mean, you might think that after the political agreement that it all's gone quiet and kind of we were a little bit resting on our laurels, but of course nothing is farther from the truth. There's a lot of work actually in getting a text into shape, a lot of scrubbing and with the linguist lawyer, so that's happening. And then of course the two institutions still need to approve the text, which we hope will, and we are confident will happen before the summer and then enter into force. Guidance, I mean, we're thinking about providing guidance. There are certain kind of implementing acts that we have to prepare that, of course, once the regulation enters into force, say by October, we need to kind of come out with. We're also already kind of in discussions with some of the potential gatekeepers about how it might all work. But I think your question was about internal organization of the Commission. I mean, we have been working hand in hand throughout the whole process with DG Competition. From the impact assessment, the public consultation, also the negotiation. This has been kind of a real team effort led by DG Competition and DG Connect as equal partners. And this is exactly the same spirit that we will bring to the implementation and the enforcement. So the measure will be enforced by DG Competition and DG Connect, working very closely together. We will put in place, I mean, I'm the director for digital transformation. I mean, at the moment, my directorate is being transformed digitally, but also physically, because my directorate will become the directorate for the enforcement of both the DSA and the DMA. And then there's also work going on in terms of creating the necessary structures in DG Competition. I think in practice, what you will see is there will be case teams. The case teams will be mixed. Colleagues from DG Competition, colleagues from DG Connect, probably look a bit at the center of gravity. I mean, if it's more like on the, say, typical more competition, level playing field issues, self-preferencing as an example, maybe Comp would take the lead and we would support and will be actively involved. If it's a bit more like on interoperability issues or access to data, where, I mean, DG Connect has a lot of expertise, it might be that kind of we will have the lead on these cases, but we will work hand in hand. And that's, of course, also true then at the political level. I mean, Executive Vice President Vestager and Commissioner Breton will, of course, also be leading and giving us the necessary guidance, of course, within the context of the Commission. So, I mean, we are preparing ourselves. We don't have that much time. I'm sure that's what everybody feels. We are going to put in place the structures. We'll have to recruit also some new colleagues, but as, I mean, in the discussions and in the negotiations, this is not the first time that question has come, like, will the Commission be ready? And of course the Commission will be ready. Mm-hmm.
And what about, if I could just jump in here in terms of the recruitment of new individuals, we're hearing that the Commission will be on the lookout for a chief technologist as part of DMA and DSA enforcement. Can you tell us any more about that?
Well, the chief technologist is the executive vice president and Commissioner Breton. I mean, they are the chief technologists because they will be kind of be responsible politically for the process. I mean, how we organize, we will need some expertise in some areas. We have a lot of expertise in the Commission, obviously in competition, but also in our areas of like interoperability, access to data. I mean, all of these issues. There is a lot of expertise in the Commission, but obviously this is quite a comprehensive framework, and you also need, it's not just the expertise which you need, but you need enough people kind of at the pump to pump. So we will increase staffing, and obviously we will then also look at kind of particular profiles which we think we will need more of. I mean, whether there will be a chief technology officer or, I mean, that kind of we will have to see. I think the important thing is this is not going to be enforced by a single person. That's, I think, what I'm saying. This is going to be enforced by teams. And so even if we have a chief technology officer, I don't think that's enough to enforce the DMA.
Mm-hmm. And Ollie, from your part, I imagine Google are working as hard, if not harder, than the Commission in this kind of interim period at the moment.
Not possible. Harder.
And we have heard, again, only rumours at the moment, but some of the potential gatekeeper platforms potentially briefing their internal and external counsel on the possibility of perhaps challenging legally some of the DMA obligations and prohibitions, as well as potentially the designation as well. Can you tell us if that's something that perhaps Google is looking into at the moment and the types of discussions you're having at the moment?
Well, I mean, look, I think that, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I think it's well known to everyone involved, I think, that, and that includes the Commission, that justice, I think, depends on a balance of rights of defense and an ability to test theories of harm. I expect that there will be many people who are considering those kinds of things, but they are well known and well established, I would say. And so moving into this kind of process, from my perspective at least, and I only represent Google, of course, I don't think you can engage constructively in a new piece of legislation where there is, as Gerard says, so much opportunity for engagement on what the legislation will mean in practice, to go into that kind of conversation with, let's say, loaded gun advocacy. I have never been involved in a negotiation where it makes sense to tell your counterparty that you intend to sue them before you've had a conversation. So that's where I stand on things. I think the rights that one has are well established. The Digital Markets Act refers to some of those rights. They're set out there. And both sides know going into these kinds of processes what your opportunities are to test theories of harm, but it seems premature to be sitting on a panel with you today saying that we intend to litigate.
But is it really premature, though? I mean, obviously not taking too much of a gung-ho approach to this. The conversations that you've had with lawyers in Brussels, I mean, have they appeared confident that Google could challenge some of these things in the DMA?
I think you may be imagining a different type of relationship that we have as we head into this process. Most of my conversations, 90% of my conversations as regards the Digital Markets Act, are with my engineers and product managers as I prepare for engagement with the Commission to talk about a complicated piece of legislation, but a piece of legislation that nevertheless has opportunities for real change. And if I want to find those opportunities for real change, things that will benefit our consumers as well as other consumers, the partners we work with, as well as other partners, I have to engage in a fact-based and evidence-based way. So my conversations are very much focused on that part of our business, and I'm not preparing with my many law firms to think about litigation.
And perhaps we could come on to products and services a bit later on, because it would be interesting to know a bit more about how Google is changing some of the ways it's doing things ahead of the DMA coming into force as and when it does do. Alexandra, coming to you now, obviously you were more involved with the DSA throughout the interinstitutional process, and you highlighted particularly the importance of involving civil society in tech regulation. In terms of future implementation and enforcement of the DSA and the DMA, how critical is that voice from civil society and from NGOs?
On? No? Yeah.
That's it.
Perfect. It's absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial because what we are facing now is an asymmetry of knowledge that especially huge corporations like the one represented here, Google, but also Meta and other ones, we know the big 5 ones, have an enormous amount of knowledge about us, but about us as individuals, but that's not so much what counts, but about us as population groups, as whole societies. And we don't know much about these companies. We don't really understand. We see the surface, but we don't really understand their inner workings. And even Oliver here said, well, I talked to the technical staff, I talked to the engineers to understand how this works. And I think we don't need to know trade secrets, but we do need to know how decisions are taken in companies that are so relevant for our democracies because they can shift public opinion. And this is why it is so important that we have that possibility in the DSA, that the Commission can look for further knowledge, can access some kind of data, that the digital service coordinators have that power, and also the civil society especially has that power. And that's why I'm very happy that now researchers that are affiliated with research institutions, with universities, but also researchers that are affiliated with non-governmental organizations who have done a huge part of the job of creating awareness for the difficult developments we have in terms of especially social networks, will have that possibility. Because what we are facing now as policymakers is we say, oh, well, this social network has had a bad influence on this process. Let's say the genocide in Myanmar is one of the famous examples of 2016 US elections, but I think there are a lot more. The companies can say, well, you can't prove that. Yes, that is true. We can't because we don't have access to the data. It's all very anecdotal. And I think this is what we need to change because we as policymakers want to make evidence-based policy. In order to make evidence-based policy, we need to have the evidence. And I think we have a lot of organizations that can ask in civil society, that can ask the right questions, that might have a different focus than the Commission or national digital services coordinators, but that ask important questions, and that they will have the possibility to cooperate with organizations being able to analyze large amounts of data in order to have results and tell us what are the mechanisms. That is so important because otherwise we are still stuck in the discussion we had before the DSA that any kind of regulation, especially of social networks, would mean to regulate content, single pieces of content. And that might infringe on freedom of expression. This is exactly what we do want to avoid. And this is why we need civil society and this voice.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in terms of the future efficacy, particularly of the Digital Services Act, does a lot of it hinge on this access to data that is part of the DSA?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that I think I explained why this is so important. And once we have the results, once we have organizations in 27 countries and maybe even organizations also in the US and other countries might benefit from this. A lot of interest in the US as well to use this possibility because the impact is obviously global and definitely transatlantic. We will see whether we need any further regulation. Let's first implement the one we have, or whether we can adapt the codes of conduct, the codes of practice, as the new one on disinformation now. And I think in 2 years from now, we will have further knowledge and will be able to adapt the instruments we have.
Mm-hmm. We've got some questions coming through now. Please do keep them coming because we would like to address them to some of our panelists. But coming back to you, Gerard, before we do hear some questions from the audience, and I imagine Ollie would like to touch on this subject a bit later on as well, regulatory dialogue. And we are aware, of course, particularly if you're a Politico Pro subscriber, that the EU will set up a new Silicon Valley base in the coming months. And your name has been touted as the EU Commission official who is going to lead the establishment of this new office. Can you tell us any more at all at this stage?
That's news to me. No, I think the thing I can say is that it could be. I mean, what is certain is that this is part of what I think Alexander referred to this. We are doing a lot in the EU. Obviously, we talk DMA and DSA, but we do AI, we do Data Act, we do cybersecurity. There's a whole range of chantiers where the European Union is very active. And I think in so doing, we're also setting a standard for the world. And the DSA and the DMA definitely have generated huge interest around the world. We could spend almost our full days, interacting with third countries who want to know, like, well, how will this work? What is behind? What's the problem you're trying to solve here? And that then requires also a digital diplomacy. There's a whole discussion going on in the European Union, how we can project, how we can kind of influence, because these are very important questions. In the world, the DSA, for example, many countries are asking themselves, how can I keep the internet safe and at the same time protect our fundamental rights and fundamental values? And there are different models. Yeah, there's the Chinese model, the Russian model, the Turkish model, very kind of repressive. That's not the model we like. Then there's maybe the US model, which is still rather laissez-faire, kind of, and then there's the European model, the human-centric model, and therefore we have an interest as a European Union to try to promote our model around the world. And one of the ways of doing this is through digital diplomacy. And then kind of, of course, in Silicon Valley, there's a lot happening. We're not going to be the delegation, not a delegation to the platforms. Like, we do have a delegation to in Vatican, in city, and to the Pope. This is not the analogy. We're there for Western United States. Of course, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the state legislature in California and Sacramento, and there's a lot of interest also in what we do in the European Union, and some copying is going on in the US of what we do, including on the DSA and the DMA. So, but we do think, particularly because in the US, say, the understanding, this is not a criticism, about what goes on in the European Union, what's behind, is often not very great, and sometimes it's turned into like a caricature. If Europe can't win on, say, the technology, then they want to become the world champion, which in the US is not so difficult. If you win the World Series for baseball, you are the world champion, even if the championship is inside the United States. But then they would say you want to be the world champion in regulation. Well, it's of course not that simple. So we hope to be able to kind of bring and also explain, like bring that perspective into the Western United States, and of course also into Silicon Valley. So that's what's behind. Whether I will lead it or not, we'll see.
Remains to be seen.
It could be.
Ollie, what's your take on this? The importance for Google of regulatory dialogue, or indeed, as Gerard puts it, digital diplomacy, particularly at this stage, but also when the DMA has been implemented and enforced?
Well, I can say it's more likely that it will be you than me, Gerard, filling that role. My perspective on digital diplomacy, listen, I think the opportunity that we have in Europe, and I include within that my European practice at Google, is to find good solutions. The instruction from my CEO is to compete in compliance. It is clear the Digital Markets Act is here, other legislation is coming, and we need to find ways to compete in compliance. What does that mean? I think that means looking at new rules, which are also being considered in other parts of the world, being creative, finding ways to solve some of the concerns that have been raised, finding opportunities for dialogue. I think that is very important also, and being pragmatic. When you're looking ahead to how a piece of legislation may be being formed and what what enforcement might look like, ultimately, there are discussions you can have, discussions you can have and conversations you can have to try and inform the types of design principles that will apply in that future. And once you have sufficient clarity, then why not move ahead? And if you're finding sensible solutions, I don't think that is something that you necessarily limit to a particular region. A good idea is a good idea. A valid concern is a valid concern. So that's how I think we're thinking about the practice in Europe, at least.
Mm-hmm. And Alexandra, what's your take on this? I mean, the possibility of having regulatory dialogue between some of the gatekeepers and the enforcers. Is there a chance that this could be abused to any extent in your view? Is this the chance that it could become some sort of a regulatory capture? What's your take on things?
I think there is a risk, absolutely. I'm very much in favor of the idea of having a European representation or a tech ambassador to the Silicon Valley, I think, or Western US. I think there was huge interest. I was there last month, and the interest is absolutely huge, not only from the platforms that are obviously well-informed directly at the source, but also from civil society. Just to tell you, I talked to a group of moms who lost their children because of challenges in social networks, anorexia and so on, caught on Instagram. And they were looking at European legislation and brought up legislation in California, as you mentioned, to protect children and minors, and they were informed about what's going on in Europe. So there's really a really strong interest. In terms of regulatory dialogue, yes, I think it's very important to make sure that civil society is at the table, because civil society sees different issues, has a different view. There's a different composition. You know, when we talk about digital policy, the DSA was a little bit an exemption because there were quite a lot of women from the parliament side negotiating, which was unusual. But usually when you talk digital politics, there's no women on the panel or very few women involved. There are very few people of color involved. So if you talk about hateful speech, for example, I think for a long time this has not been taken seriously because, I know this sounds a little bit of provocation, but white men are not that much target. If you talk to women, they live in a different internet. If you talk to people of color, you talk to people who in Europe don't come from a different country than the one they live in, and you can tell that from their skin color. They live in a different internet. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important that civil society is at the table, that there's a degree of transparency. You can't maybe talk about everything openly, but there needs to be a degree of transparency, because otherwise the regulation will not really protect the people and the citizens.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions we have coming in from the audience now. And there's one here for you, Gerard. And Max Vonton asks, when it comes to the DMA's obligations for gatekeepers, will the Commission prioritise enforcing certain requirements first, for example, enabling installation of alternative app stores, or will it attempt to enforce them all simultaneously?
It's the latter, of course. The legislators have co-legislators have defined these practices as unfair, and not saying, well, these are kind of more unfair than these others, and therefore why don't you concentrate on the enforcement of these practices and then look later at the other practices. Of course, that's not the way European regulation will be and can be implemented. So we make no distinction. We will enforce the whole DMA and not just part of the DMA.
That's quite a lot of work for you to do, Ollie, isn't it? I mean, if all of these prohibitions and obligations come at once, your products and services will have to be brought up to gear fairly quickly, won't they?
I mean, Jared's quite right. I mean, as a legal matter, there's a compliance obligation that triggers on a particular date. I think what that militates in favour of is starting as quickly as possible to discuss and to understand what you need to do. I think there are, as I've said, I think there are real opportunities for a company like Google, off the back of evidence-based discussions, to find places where they can quickly engage with these rules and find the kinds of solutions that the Commission has in mind with the new, with its enforcement of the new legislation. I think there are a raft of places where that's possible, and I think it's incumbent on us to organise ourselves, to clear our agendas, to come with open minds, and to find those opportunities as quickly as possible, because then at least hopefully we narrow the field of things that one has to do over a period of time. You cannot wait until 2024 to comply. You have to start thinking about that immediately.
Right, and just taking that a step further then, because we touched on this a bit earlier on, in terms of Google's products and services and those conversations that you're having with engineers now, what changes are you starting to consider in order to comply before you have to, essentially?
I mean, I think there are a number of places where, notwithstanding the fact that, as Gerard Quarelli says, this is a new piece of legislation, some of the ideas and concepts do borrow from previous cases. The notion of self-preferencing has been well discussed on dozens, hundreds of panels at this point, and I think that informs, as an example, how one might think about the types of solutions that are going to be effective to address 6.1d, which has become, I forget with the new numbering, the self-referencing provision. So there are a number of places where I think one can move quickly. I think that some of the provisions are, I would posit, rather clear on their face. There are contractual provisions that are no longer permitted. I think as a lawyer, that gives you a pretty clear steer on what one needs to do. There are others which will require some work and discussion. I think certain other provisions that focus on data controls, data use, data siloing, will involve some technical conversations between us and the Commission. 5.2, 6.1, 6.8, 6.9, these are all provisions that deal with handling of data, but as has also been said on many panels, data and how it's organized and controlled within a company will vary very much. So there'll be some serious investigation and discussion to be done in those areas, but there are several provisions where I think one can move quickly.
I'm hearing some of those numbers back again in my nightmares almost every night now of the DMA obligations and prohibitions, but I'm sure we all are here in this audience. Gerard, in your conversations with some of the, again, potential gatekeepers, what sort of concerns are they raising? I mean, is it similar to what Ollie is saying with regards to these specific provisions, or is there anything specifically within the DMA that they are attempting to resist at the moment?
I mean, we're starting these conversations. So it's not that we've been discussing this for a long time already with the gatekeepers. Of course, during the negotiations, some of these issues were raised, and I think we're all aware of kind of how does this interact with data protection, how does this interact with kind of the importance of cybersecurity. So those issues have been raised in a general manner. I think we're starting here more at the kind of high-level issues. I mean, what are the core? I mean, how do you delineate? How do you define core platform services? Because of course, some companies are kind of, I mean, they have different core platform services, so how do you kind of separate one core platform service from another core platform services? So that's the type of discussion that we're having. I'm sure over the next couple of weeks and months we'll go deeper, but the discussions are, I mean, they're constructive, they're kind of more inquiring and testing a little bit, but nothing kind of yet. I see this arm wrestling. I mean, in the title of this, I mean, at least it's better than mud wrestling, I guess. But I haven't kind of. I mean, that's not the mood in which we are. I mean, we have been over the last, say, well, the period of negotiation, and it's not the mood we're in at the moment. I think it's really kind of roll up your sleeve and see how we can make this work, and that's I think the right approach.
Okay.
By the way, I agree with everything that Alexander Geese has said about the DSA, and also want to give credit to you for pushing these issues in the negotiations in the Parliament. It certainly helped to make the DSA stronger.
And Alexandra, just to come back to you on some of the points Gerard made there with regards to concerns being raised previously from industry representatives, from civil society representatives, etc., throughout the interinstitutional process for the DSA and the DMA. What did the lobbying picture look like to you? Because obviously you're someone who followed things quite closely with regards to certain trade associations, etc. What was the picture like for you?
Well, there was a huge campaign, I would say, especially, interestingly enough, on the advertising issue. Because when we started the DSA, it was all about liability, and we ended up discussing advertising a lot, which was, I think, in part due to the fact that it was politically raised in the European Parliament, and partly due to the fact that especially Google and Meta, who are the main players, control 80% of online advertising, 85%, I think, ran a huge campaign on this. And I think it was remarkable because that campaign meant that it went far beyond the usual stakeholder meetings that policymakers do that are done with the Commission. And there was an interesting report that said that large part of the meetings also of the Commission and the Commissioner was with or the companies themselves or the trade associations, and not much with civil society, which might be understandable in the context of the DMA, but a lot less in the context of the DSA, which is really about protecting also democracy and freedom of speech and so on. And there were operations that were really, really, I think, not fair and shouldn't be really part, like making up basically organizations representing small companies. And then when I passed this data to journalists of a famous German newspaper who contacted those small businesses that were supposed to be represented and sending us emails on behalf of this supposed organization, said, well, we don't know anything about it. Or organizing meetings between small entrepreneurs from Eastern Europe and making them meet their MEPs in Brussels. I think that's a little bit difficult. That went a lot beyond. The problem we have also as policymakers, and this is why I said we need evidence-based, we need the evidence to make evidence-based policy, that many research institutions, universities are co-funded in some way, totally legally. I'm not accusing you of anything, totally legally, or Google, Meta, Amazon. The Brussels think tanks, I think there was a list of 17 or 18. I didn't find anyone, any of them who's not co-funded by Google, Meta, Amazon. We had that problem even in the IMCO committee. We asked for an independent study on targeted advertising and found out the day it was presented that the professor of a French university who is a known expert on the topic presenting the data to us, presented it in a very particular way. The study was good. It was co-written by, I think, 20 or 30 researchers. The study was very good, showed both aspects, was very detailed, and he focused on one point of view, and then we figured out during the meeting that he is leading a think tank that really has the mission to bring across the private sector's view and is funded by, I think it was Google and Meta, I'm not sure anymore, Google was in it anyway. And there was not much transparency about it, it was not clearly said, there was no disclosure of this in the meeting, so all the MEPs were listening to his view and thought, well, and the journalists and everybody was connected to the meeting. It was during COVID times. And we found that out later, but then it's very difficult
just to cut across quickly,
later.
Alexandra,
Yes.
here, how much of an impact did those lobbying efforts actually have? Because it strikes me as the institutions were actually quite steadfast in what they wanted to do, and in the end it wasn't too heavily influenced.
I think it's a mixed bag. I think without the lobbying we would have been able to do more, but it was also remarkable how the democratic institutions were able in some way to resist to that kind of lobbying. So I think it was a very mixed bag. I think we would have gotten more, and especially on like the advertising, the very technical economic sectors where people, my colleagues who didn't spend a year in trying to find out how the system works because it's very intransparent, very technical, very complicated. You need to talk to the right people, spend a lot of time. You don't have that time in politics if you don't specialize on that topic. I think it worked, the lobbying worked, but up to a point, we still managed to have limitations. I think it was a mixed bag. So I'm not saying it did have an influence, but it was not a total influence. We still managed to get really good things and to come across with our points. So, I mean, as it happens in democracy, the problem is that civil society doesn't have the same kind of means as a large company like Google, for example. Mm-hmm. And there we have this imbalance again. Civil society they come one time in organization, they have maybe 3 or 4 people staff in Brussels, so they meet with the people if you call them up, or they try to meet policymakers, but they don't have that kind of possibility to talk to everybody, to finance studies, to finance universities, and so on. So the asymmetry is really problematic. Considering that, I think we did held up as democratic institutions.
Gerard, I just want to come back to you quickly before we do a round of closing remarks. How do we analyse the future efficacy of the Digital Markets Act in particular? Is it going to be a reduction in big tech antitrust cases? Are we going to see less abusive behaviour, such as the ones included in the prohibitions and obligations before? How do we, in the future, analyse the success of this landmark regulation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the regulation is quite clear. It identifies 18 practices that henceforth, once the regulation enters into force, are no longer allowed in the European Union. So if you want to do business in the European Union, you can't do any of these practices. Well, some, I think half of them are relatively clear. I mean, just stop it. It's not so complicated. Just don't do it. Other half is it requires some actions, as Ollie also said, and maybe so even some. I mean, certainly some re-engineering of the business model. And there, then you need to have this more regulatory dialogue. Well, what is the best way to comply? And I fully agree. I mean, this cannot just be a dialogue between, say, the Commission and, say, a particular gatekeeper. This needs to be a dialogue where also civil society and other interested parties and companies need to be part of, and so that's where more like, well, how would you do it? But I mean, how do we define success? That as soon as possible, all of these practices are no longer practiced in the European Union, and we will enforce that. I mean, scrupulously. That's our role. What will be the impact on competition policy? I mean, quite a few cases indeed are, I mean, inspired by kind of earlier competition cases, but we also know these take a long time, etc. So the ex ante has this advantage. It just kind of it kicks in immediately. It doesn't. It's not case by case. It's the kind of more horizontal. So I mean, logically, you would expect to see less need, because that's where that kind of complementarity comes in. If you just through ex ante regulations say this is not allowed, I mean, why would you? I mean, then you would need to, because there's a failure. You don't. The regulation isn't working. Then you need to go back to competition enforcement. But that we do not expect. Competition enforcement can still be very important. I mean, there might be practices that can, because this is a very fast-moving market, so there might be new practices that are not captured within the scope of the DMA. Well, then you can use the pending potential kind of updating of the DMA. You might need to revert to competition policy if we feel that that's something that we wouldn't want to see in the European Union. So that's where, I mean, we'll see in the future how this will work, the interaction between these two instruments. I mean, what we would see is indeed, I mean, the grip of gatekeepers. I mean, their position in the market. I mean, that the markets will become much more contestable, that they can be dislodged, that there is going to be more innovation. I mean, other alternative business models will have a chance to compete. We will see less of these walled gardens. These walled gardens will be opened up, and therefore, again, there are going to be opportunities for new provision of services. There will be more access to data that companies can use to improve their offers and serve customers, give them a better experience. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for increased competitiveness, for new growth. I mean, for startups to become successful. That's what we expect to see. I mean, how long will this take? I mean, this may take a little bit of time, but I mean, we will want to see no more of these practices once the regulation enters into force. And that's the first kind of benchmark of success. This should be behind us. This is not any more allowed in the European Union.
Thank you.
Then we'll have to see what the companies do outside of the European Union. This will be an interesting experience, like in the US. Well, I mean, this of course not only applies to US companies, but if US companies in Europe are giving, say, certain benefits to European companies or even consumers, but in the US they maintain the kind of unfair business practice as well. That's going to be something interesting to explain by US politicians.
Perhaps, if I may, Gerard. Just for the closing statements now, because I'm conscious of the time. Your products and services, Ollie. I mean, Gerard said there, you know, it'll be interesting to see what Google does outside of the European Union, obviously in compliance with the EU's DMA. Just perhaps to conclude your contribution to today's session, what does the future look like for Google with the DMA rules in place in the near future?
It's a very big question. I mean, well, let me put it this way. I think I come to panels like this to hear a breadth of perspectives, because I think it's very important for me to be continuing to channel back into Google what the expectations are from people outside of Google. And that's why it's a useful opportunity for me. And I think there are probably 3 takeaways I have as I think about how we should be designing products and thinking about the evolution of our services in the context of the Digital Markets Act. First, we need to be open and improve the understanding, as Alexandra, I think, opened with, the understanding of how these products work. That is absolutely essential. You can't take positions for or against without sharing that information and helping people understand how the products work. That's very clear, and a principle that I also believe in, to be frank. A fair representation of views. I hear that loud and clear. You know, I think it is not just Google's views. It is not just the views of our partners or customers. It's not just the GAFA views. And it's also not the Commission's view only that's relevant in what a right solution is going to look like under any of these rules. There's a duty on us to ensure that there are adequate disclosures, that we're providing real evidence when it comes to that kind of debate, but also trying to create the opportunities for dialogue between us, the Commission, and other stakeholders, so we can get to the kinds of information and exchanges that are going to be most useful, I think, to everyone that's involved. And finally, as I've said before, a sense of creativity and engagement. Gerald's just set out sort of the beginning of a vision for how the new future, the DMA-regulated future, will look. I think Google has to be part of that. I think we have to provide options and explain how this could look, what's possible, what's not possible, debate and provide a fully fleshed out vision for our products in the Digital Markets Act. And I'm optimistic. I think there are opportunities to make real, material, beneficial changes.
Wonderful, thank you. There is a little voice in my ear telling me to rush on and close this session. Unfortunately, I'm not a manic schizophrenic. I do have an earpiece telling me what to do. So unfortunately, we're going to have to close this afternoon's panel on the EU's arm wrestling with big tech there, and with it, the public part of this year's summit. So I think a big round of applause to our panel who have joined us this afternoon. Thank you very much for taking the time out. Thank you to our audience, both online and virtually, for staying with us over the past 2 days as we've explored the future of competition policy in an unstable geopolitical context, and one in which we are re-emerging from the coronavirus pandemic, while at the same time continuing to pursue broader political objectives regarding the digital and green transitions. This summit couldn't have been made possible without the support of our partners, Generali, Google, the European Roundtable for Industry, Yara, and the McKinsey Global Institute. So a big thank you to them too. It's that time of the day where business cards are being handed out and corridors are peopled by those wishing to network and have a chat. So please do stick around and grab one of us before you go, if that's your bag. But if your appetite hasn't yet been satisfied by the policy discussions here, we do have a couple of other panels conducted under Chatham House rules just about to start. If you'd like to hang around in person, in an adjoining room, we'll have a roundtable discussion on the CO2 border tax, moderated by senior climate correspondent Carl Mathieson. And if you're joining virtually, you can access a roundtable discussion on Europe's supply chains conundrum, moderated by senior trade correspondent Barbara Moens. And that is only available through the Swap Card application. Thank you indeed once more for joining us over the past 2 days, and we shall see you for another Competitive Europe Summit in June 2023. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.